Few leaders have shaped modern military strategy and global security like General David Petraeus. Over a 37-year Army career, he commanded coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and rose to four-star general. He later served as director of the CIA, guiding U.S. intelligence through a pivotal moment in the fight against terrorism. Today, he chairs the KKR Global Institute, advises companies worldwide, and continues to teach and write on strategy and security, including as co-author of the bestseller, and I will tell you, a phenomenal book called Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza. Highly decorated and globally respected, General Petraeus remains a leading voice on military affairs and global challenges. General Petraeus, I am so glad you are at this table. Thank you for joining the Swift Hour.
Well, I'm delighted as well. Thanks and congratulations on what already is an extraordinary gathering.
Well, you played a huge part in why, frankly, this has been not just an extraordinary gathering, but a rather unique one for the world. I would like to go right in to talk about the interview and conversation that you had with President Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of Syria's transitional government. I think what I find, I've been telling people for the last few weeks that he's coming, and people say, wow, that's fascinating. And then I stop them in their tracks when I say that General David Petraeus is going to be the one interviewing him. What was that like to go full circle in a connection that you've had with this man for decades, but through very different circumstances?
Sure. Well, it was nothing short of extraordinary in certain ways. It was also very, very heartening. I was hugely impressed. He and I were on different sides during the surge in Iraq. He was enjoyed our hospitality for 5 years as a detainee. Again, had an interesting path to the leadership of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham at HTS, essentially a Sunni insurgent group in Syria fighting against the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime. An extraordinary leader, really, when you think about what he did to build a force. This just wasn't a bunch of tribal militias that all came together. There was real structure to this. There was real recruiting, training, equipping, leader development courses, all of this. And then what really struck me about our conversation was the kind of mastery that he has, not just of fighting, which he'd been doing. I think he was fighting in some way or other for something like 18 years, he said. But now he has a real mastery of all things economics, political, the regional dynamics. I was really impressed by what he laid out for us, the detail that he had, and then in the working group that we did prior to that with many of them are Syrian American businessmen and so forth that want to go in and help. They want to return to the country from which they had to flee during the al-Assad period. So again, he also has this very calm demeanor, you could see, soft-spoken. And, when I asked, how's it going, essentially, how are you doing personally? Because I've, again, had something like what he's had, not the complete responsibilities. And it's a grinding experience. And he seems to be just moving through all of this with enormous equanimity and, again, very, very impressive vision and leadership.
I want to ask you about some elements that really tie to your leadership experiences and things that you have done and what that sort of life is like. But before we do that, what is the next big test for him and his ability to be successful? What do you see as the next big test?
Well, he's got to bring together a country. So when I was a two-star general, we went north. We did the fight to Baghdad. I was privileged to command the Great 101st Airborne Division. We're then sent suddenly, very surprisingly, north to Mosul. That wasn't where we were supposed to end up. And Nainawa province is a microcosm of what you have in Syria. It has almost all the ethnic, sectarian, and tribal fault lines you can possibly imagine in the Middle East, a much smaller scale than the 25 million people of Syria today. But the challenge there was, how do you bring people together who have a history of animosity with one another? And in his case, he's got real challenges in that regard. Very briefly, the map, you have the Free Syrian Army, remnants of that, which are largely aligned with Turkey and right up against the border. You have the Alawites, the former regime, are on the coast in the west on the Mediterranean. You have his elements over which he has influence, again, the HTS coalition, if you will, that stretches from Aleppo, Hama Homs, and then down to Damascus. You have some other elements down there that are contiguous to Jordan. You have the Druze community that has been on the receiving end of some concerning violence. You have the Syrian Democratic Forces over here that a small element of U.S. military is still supporting. We built them basically, and then enabled them to defeat the Islamic State in Syria, as we did the same thing for the Iraqi security forces in the north. And then you even there's a huge refugee camp down near a place called Al-Tanf, which has a U.S. presence that secures those refugees. It's probably 50,000 or more. So again, you put all this together, and then there's desert in between and so forth. This is hugely challenging. How do you reassure the Syrian Kurds that they should actually give up their weapons and trust the Syrian armed forces? How do you assure these other minorities? The big idea when I was in Mosul, for example, was we want to establish a government that is representative of all the people. So again, all the ethnic, sectarian, tribal, political, even other elements of society, businessmen, retired generals, the university, et cetera, with majority rule, but absolute minority rights. And that's the real challenge. The minority rights piece is what everyone is going to watch. Now, also, can you run an election? Can you have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so forth? Can this really be done in a country that was really held together for over 50 years by a brutal dictator, Hafez al-Assad, and then his son Bashar? This is a really big challenge. Beyond that, how do you bring an economy back? The only productive piece of which in the final years under Bashar was basically an illegal narcotic called Captagon. So they've cut the production and export of that rightly because it was poisoning the entire region. But what do you replace that with? And again, it goes on and on. Energy is a challenge. Even water is going to be a challenge. So the size of these issues with which he has to deal, that he has to resolve, is really quite enormous. And what impressed me was that he really has thought it through. In the working group, there was actually a question: how would you compare yourself to Singapore back when they were formed? And someone here's what the leader of Singapore did at that time. He said, we're actually better off than Singapore. Wow. Why? Well, because they're much more literate. And so he's really thought through other analogous situations, Brazil also at their, but the size of the task is just huge. And we need to do everything we can, I think, to help make him a success. His success is our success, as we often used to say to local leaders when we're trying to help them get established.
So let's now because thank you for that coverage, because I do think it was an extraordinary conversation. And I did love that you asked him genuinely, how are you doing? This is a huge task ahead for him.
It is.
And you can relate.
I have been there to a degree. Again, actually, he rightly said, my task is even bigger than what you had. And it is. But nonetheless, commanding in combat has some very, very tough moments to it. Particularly, frankly, the first 7-8 months of the surge were just a grinding experience, but also the most important task I ever undertook.
So let's dive into the experience that got you there and start. You go back to West Point, your career in the Army, CIA. Now you're in the private sector. You're not just running the Global Institute. You're also running all investments in the Middle East for KKR. I hope I'm articulating that correctly. Yeah,
I'm the chairman, so I have a new, no retired general ever turns down a new title or a new medal. And so I'm a partner in KKR first and foremost, and have been for now well over nearly 12 years or so. Again, chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which does the geopolitical risk assessment during the diligence process and ensures that we can sufficiently mitigate the risks that we identify, that they won't prevent a successful outcome. 6 times we've said you can't do this deal over the objection of the deal team. Every time it has been validated subsequently, and the deal team thanks us for standing in front of them and the investment committee. More importantly, though, we actually help resolve problems once they emerge. And so about 60 times roughly over that 12-year period, we've had to go out and use the relationships we have and so forth to resolve issues that the local team couldn't do and the regional team couldn't do, and sometimes the global team couldn't do.
So are there constant lessons of leadership, experiences from
Yeah.
when you go from West Point
Yes.
to
Yeah.
to the Army, CIA, KKR?
Yeah.
Could you bridge that for us?
First of all, there's a couple of realities that I actually share with young folks when they're saying, "Sir, what would you advise?" And I say, well, my first bit of advice is to recognize that life is a competitive endeavor. And you really don't get a T-shirt or a trophy just for showing up like you do in kids' soccer. You get it for being the best. And you want to be the best. You're not always, but you want to always try to be the best. And while doing so, you want to be the best team player you can be as well. Second, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You should be preparing constantly for that moment when the call comes, Petraeus for field marshal or something like that. And I'm actually very, very serious about that. Beyond that, before taking command of the surge, I developed an intellectual construct for strategic leadership that I think is really very useful because it keeps you focused on the most important task of a leader at the very top, which is to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy, to understand the situation, all the dynamics, et cetera, deal with it the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be, and again, get the strategy right. By the way, we failed for 13 years in Vietnam to get the right big ideas. And by the time we finally got them, it was really too late. We'd lost the country back home. It took us 8 years in Afghanistan to get the big ideas right. It took us a number of years in Iraq to recognize that the big ideas that we had were no longer valid, that clear and leave or clear and hand off to Iraqi forces wasn't working, that we had to do clear, hold, build. Now, everyone looks back on that after the fact and says, well, of course that's what you had to do. Well, except that we weren't doing it, and there was resistance to doing it. In fact, most of the advisors opposed the president's decision to send additional forces. But keep in mind that what mattered most in the surge wasn't the additional forces, it was the new big ideas. Again, 180-degree change. You can't do change management any bigger. So first, get the big ideas right. You then have to communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and to all who have a stake in the outcome. So it's not just all the way down to the ranks that are actually turning my big ideas into concrete action at their level outside the wire in uniform, Kevlar, weapon, doing what only they can do, which is to engage the enemy and engage the population. But it's also their mothers and fathers back home. It's the White House, it's the Pentagon, it's number 10 Downing Street, it's the Iraqi White House, it's all my counterparts there. So you have to do that, and you do it through all sorts of different ways, and even the American public. I was pretty visible. I had to be. Actually, there needed to be a face of the surge. I knew that was true. I knew that most people in Washington could not do that, and therefore recognized that. Now, a subsequent administration saw that as being a celebrity general, but we needed to do that at the time. Then the third task is to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what you normally think of as leadership. This is the energy the leader gives, the example, the inspiration. It's hiring and attracting the best and brightest, incentivizing them, hanging on to them as long as you possibly can, letting those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the architecture for the organization that you develop to carry out this task. There's no one size that fits all. It's the metrics that you use, and we ratcheted those down big time because I said, I'm going to lay these out to Congress at the 6-month testimony, and we're going to live or die on these. So I need to understand precisely what the definition is, who owns it. I want him standing in front of me, Chief Warrant Officer 4 or 5, in sharpshoot, and then I have confidence in those numbers. And then it is actually how you spend your time. Your battle rhythm is hugely important. We spent a lot of time actually determining how I should could most effectively, efficiently, and productively use my time. And then, so it's the recurring meetings, the substance of them, the frequency, et cetera. And then there's a fourth task. And if you overlook this task, you end up like Kodak, which had 2,000 patents on digital photography when it was the king of film and film photography services, and failed to make that the new big idea. Others got there first, and they've never recovered from that. This is to sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the situation evolves, as you achieve progress, as you experience setbacks, and all the rest of that. That process then just continues and continues and continues. But what it drives you to is the big ideas, and you've just constantly got to get those right. By the way, A strategic leader can be someone commanding 250,000 troops in U.S. Central Command, the greater Middle East, or it can be a founder of a startup with as many people as could sit around this table. You still have to perform those tasks. Now, those below the strategic leader still perform these 4 tasks. They just don't have the latitude when it comes to the very, very top big ideas. They're sort of stuck. If a commander in Vietnam says we want to win a war of attrition with North Vietnam and the Viet Cong insurgents in the South and embarks on a big war, that was the wrong strategy. We could not win that war. We should have been focusing on security of the people, securing them where they lived, not out in the jungles and highlands, fighting for territory that we would then typically leave after we'd fought over it very hard and taken very heavy casualties. Even at a 10-to-1 exchange rate, if you will, 10 of them for every one of us, that just was not a viable strategy. And in fact, one of the participants in it, one of the great heroes who wrote the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, also a great movie, I'd read that book earlier when I was a battalion commander, lieutenant colonel, because that's what he was in the Battle of the Ai Drang with the 1st Air Cavalry Division and so forth. I read it for the battlefield stuff. When I went back to do the chapter for conflict, which you kindly noted, and that was my PhD dissertation at Princeton as well, but at the 10-year mark instead of the 40-year mark or whatever, I read the end of the book where he said, I'm not sure that the commander in Vietnam really understood that 10-to-1 was not all that great to America's mothers and fathers. And it was a pretty profound observation. So you've got to get the big ideas right. I mean, I can give you an example of one. This is a challenging one because I strongly want the Israelis to achieve their 3 objectives in the wake of the brutal, horrific killings and so forth of 10/7. And they did magnificently against Hezbollah. Phenomenal big ideas, including the best ever supply chain operation. I mean, having all the pagers blow up in one day, thousands of them, and then the walkie-talkies blow up the next. I mean, this is better than the Trojan horse. This is phenomenal. And it paved the way for real serious damage to Hezbollah from which they can't remotely recover. That sets the stage for Syria's transformation in large part. That's very helpful. And then the 12-day campaign against Iran was masterful as well, just extraordinary stuff. But Gaza, where the 3 objectives are to destroy Hamas, keep Hamas from governing again, and get the hostages back, those are not achievable with the strategy they are pursuing. Nor is what I would submit should be a 4th objective, which is to provide a better future for the Palestinian people without Hamas in their midst. In other words, to separate the people from the enemy, which is what you want to do in a counterinsurgency. Hamas is no longer organized companies, battalions, brigades. They're now insurgents. They're guerrillas, and there should be a counterinsurgency campaign, not and the way you would do that is with population control measures, which is what we did during the surge in Iraq. So you take Fallujah, yes, it's tiny compared with 2 million people in Gaza, but it was 250, 300,000 people. You carve it up into 12 gated communities, as we call them. In fact, I told the people of Fallujah, you pay a lot of money for a gated community in Florida, and we're giving it to you for free. But what you do is you wall it off. So in this case, to take it into Gaza, you come north 1 kilometer down, east-west wall, 3 north-south walls. You can throw those up very quickly. It's only 12 miles. We did that in multiple locations every single night that we were in Iraq during the surge. You then clear every building, floor, room, cellar, and plug every tunnel entrance, and they have the ability to do that. You now have security. There is not security right now anywhere in Gaza. There's a lot of fighting, but even the provision of humanitarian assistance turns into a real challenge, and often it's so overwhelmed that people end up getting killed just in the process of giving out food. But once you have security, then contractors can deliver that very easily. Humanitarian groups can come in. Arabs will come in if there is security. They're not going to go in if they have to fight Hamas on behalf of Israel. The assistance, then you get the people back into the areas where their homes were, because most of the homes are destroyed. Biometric ID cards that allow them to come and go. You cut entry and control points into these 4 locations. They're manned by the Israelis because the entry control point is everything. And you have a chicane so suicide bombers can't, all the rest of this. And just do it again and again. In Gaza City, yep, you're going to have to slice that up and so forth. But the absolute foundation, there's an iconic figure from Vietnam, John Paul Vann, first as a military who said we are fighting with the wrong strategy. Then as a civilian, he came back. He was a 3-star equivalent, actually a commander in civilian clothes. He used to say that security may be 10% of the problem or 90% of the problem. Whatever it is, it's the first 10% or the first 90%. I want them to achieve these objectives. I have had the conversation with the former Minister of Defense, actually many times, and the challenges are political issues there that probably prevent this from being realized. But that's an example of you got to get the big ideas right. In fact, I think the Vietnam chapter, we quote Clausewitz, who says the foremost task of a commander is to determine the nature of the war that he is fighting, and not to try to make it into what it is not, but to fight it the way it is. It's a little bit, perhaps, the CIA director learns really early on, you have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. And that can be a real shortcoming if you don't get the big ideas.
I will emphasize again, the book is tremendous. I mean, it really is an incredible guide. I want to end this conversation, though, with a bit of a side-by-side comparison to the U.S. and China when it comes to military investment and military modernization. Where do you see things going, especially when you look at the manufacturing limitations we seem to have, certainly compared to what China has?
I go to Ukraine quite regularly. I think it was a 7th trip 2 weeks ago, actually. And it is extraordinary to see the future of war. And the future of war is like nothing we've ever seen before. It's largely unmanned systems, and increasingly unmanned systems against unmanned systems. But the Russians who are on the offensive, they can no longer, combined arms warfare is no longer tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, air defense, combat engineers, infantry protecting all this, jammers, logistics, and so forth. It's now, because all of these are vulnerable, the Ukrainians are producing 3.5 million drones this year alone, and they could produce more, and we should provide more for them. And I'll actually end when I talk about what we should be doing in Ukraine, because I was also last week in Warsaw, Paris, Brussels, NATO and EU, and then Helsinki. But that's the future of war. China is going to school in that future of war big time, and they're also the critical enabler to Russia with all the components, parts, et cetera, chips, magnets, and so forth for the military-industrial complex of Russia, it's now a war economy. And they are making changes, I think, more rapidly than we may be. There's no question about our preeminence still, but keep in mind that we're doing that in the entire world. They're largely focused on the area around their country. Yes, they're spreading their wings. They have a port in Africa and some others. But it's really about the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, Yellow Sea, and so forth.
And they're not pursuing the same capability from a force projection standpoint that we have?
They are pursuing. They're making aircraft carriers. They're making other systems. But you have to keep in mind that in a world of ubiquitous surveillance, which is what we're in now, if it's on the surface of the water and above, you can see it. You can find it. And if you can find it, you can target it. If you can target, you can probably kill it. Now, yes, we have a boat, we have defenses, we have all kinds of other capabilities. But and then you have to be standoff from certain of the capabilities in particular. If we want to turn the Taiwan Strait into a hellscape, which is what the admiral in charge of the Indo-Pacific Command has said is the desire, and you have to have massive numbers of unmanned systems under the water, on the surface of the water, in the air, on the ground, in outer space, in cyberspace, even in cognitive space. And I don't think we're moving rapidly enough yet. And I do think the Chinese are moving much more rapidly. And when the manufacturing colossus of the world, when they turn their mind to that, they can really produce at a scale that is extraordinary. We should be learning much more from the war in Ukraine. We don't have the traditional Army lessons learned, Marine Corps lessons learned, special ops lessons learned, joint lessons learned that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'd meet with them or on my battle rhythm, because that's one of the ways that I got input on lessons that needed to be learned, but they're not learned until they're incorporated in the big ideas, communicated and implemented and so forth. So I am concerned that we are not as aggressively. Now, the service chiefs know they need to do this, but as the great Senator John McCain used to note, the military-industrial congressional complex has vested interests in legacy systems, processes, bases, maintenance agreements, you name it. And it's really hard to make the changes as rapidly. Now, the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense of War, he signed it out. We would need to accelerate this. There are others. I wish DOGE had taken on the military procurement system at the outset. Just focus on it. Because it really needs that kind of intensive look. So I'm concerned that the Chinese are learning more rapidly than we are, and that would have really grave consequences. We can turn this around. We have agency. We have to remember that our number one task in the world for the U.S. military is deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Deterrence is founded on two elements: the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. And we have to make sure that there is no doubt about either of those, while not ever being needlessly provocative, trying to have a relationship with our third largest trading partner and so forth. But let me finish very quickly with
on Ukraine, right?
I think it was right and good that President Trump tried to use his personal relationship with President Putin to bring that war to a close, stop the killing, as he has put it. Admirable. We literally rolled out the red carpet for Putin, had the meetings in Anchorage. And how has Putin answered that? With the largest numbers of drone strikes and missiles since the beginning of the war repeatedly. Track it, by the way. I'm on LinkedIn and I post on Ukraine and also the Middle East every single night.
Anyone who wants to track the war, they've got to follow those LinkedIn
posts. The credit goes to the Institute for the Study of War, on whose board I sit and where there's a Petraeus Center, but I take the highlights that they have, distill them, and put it on LinkedIn with the maps and the graphs that show it. He sent 19 drones into Polish airspace. He's violated Romania's airspace, and then most recently, fighters were flying around Estonia, and others buzzed an oil platform. That is not the kind of response that clearly President Trump and all of us had hoped to see. It's very clear to me at this point that there are not going to be serious negotiations. President Zelensky has been willing to do them. I don't think he should go to Moscow, where he was invited. That probably would be an unwise destination. But what we now need to do, I think, with the learning that comes from what has transpired and a valiant effort, is that we should be pursuing three lines of effort simultaneously. The first is to enable Ukraine to change the dynamics on the battlefield to where we help them so much that they can stop the Russians cold, that the Russians, no matter how many casualties they're willing to take, and they've already taken over 1,050,000 killed and wounded. I can't comprehend these numbers, actually, as someone who spent just about every night of 5 combat commands as a general officer writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers. It's beyond me. But so you got to stop them. There's a number of actions, specific actions to take, and then also to enable them more to withstand the kind of enormous attacks by drones and missiles that Russia has been sending their way. The second, and by the way, part of that is to get the money that is frozen in Europe into a usable instrument. It's about $250 billion equivalent, Russian reserves that are frozen there. To use that to underwrite Euroclear bonds or whatever mechanism that basically gives that money to Ukraine. And that would enable them to produce 5-6 million drones this year. By the way, they're using nearly 7,000 drones on a daily basis. It's just staggering what they're doing.
The numbers are unbelievable.
It is. And by the way, there's unmanned ground systems now. There's remotely controlled vehicles and machine guns on them that are remotely controlled. There are automatic grenade launchers they've done the first ever offensive with no soldiers involved except for those that are operating the ground, air, and I drove the maritime drone the last time I was there. We hit 100 kilometers an hour on the water. It's staggering. How does a country that has no navy sink 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet? Aerial drones that find the ships and maritime drones that sink them. The entire Black Sea Fleet that's left is bottled up in a harbor as far from Ukraine as it can possibly be, and it no longer goes to sea. It's extraordinary. And then think about Operation Spiderweb, where the Ukrainians put these drones in the roofs of these long-haul tractor-trailer trucks some of them thousands of kilometers apart, all near strategic air bases. All of a sudden they pop out and a couple $1 million worth of drones damages or destroys $7 billion worth of strategic aircraft. We need to enable that even more, and that can be reality if we unfreeze those reserves and get them to Ukraine. And they're very close now to agreeing on that. I was at the EU headquarters. I talked to Ursula von der Leyen,
that would
the
be an
president.
extraordinary amount of resources towards that effort.
It would. Second is we have to crush the Russian war machine and punish those who are enabling it. And the enablers are those that are providing the components to Russia to keep their military industrial base going. And it's those who are buying the oil and gas. Now, you have to do this pragmatically. You don't draconian. You have to think your way through the way we did during the sanctions on Iran leading up to the Iran nuclear deal. And I was the CIA director at the time. I was the one who would go to King or the ambassador of Saudi Arabia and say, okay, the next round of sanctions, they'll take 1.5 million barrels per day off the market. Can you bring 1.5 million on? And they're the only country that holds several million barrels off the market usually, just to keep prices where they would like to see them be. And they would agree. And then I asked them, will you tell the entire market? They said, no, but we'll tell the 4 largest customers. So you have to think about how and keep in mind, the EU has reduced the price that's allowed to pay. So you work your way through that as well. And then finally, what we have to do is all together is provide credible guarantees, ironclad guarantees to Ukraine for what we'll do if Russia continues to carry out aggression, and ironclad guarantees of what we'll do to Russia if they do as well, so if you can get to a ceasefire. Only if you do these 3 actions all simultaneously do I think you can actually have the prospect for meaningful negotiations and a durable end to this war.
Well, let's leave it there at that important moment of where we need to go, following, frankly, a remarkable morning that reflects how the world has just changed so dramatically. And let's hope that that change extends to many of the ideas you have talked about in terms of U.S.-China competitiveness, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza. Let's hope that same speed of change applies.
Inshallah, touch wood, and congratulations again on an extraordinary gathering and your leadership of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.